Okay. Please crowd in, take a seat. Sit back, relax. Enjoy your lecture. How is it going? I didn't fully understand. How is it going? Okay. That's week-free energy. I see that. My name is Matteo. I'm super happy to be here. It's the third year I run this module in this course. It's the first time I see all of you, I think. You might see me in the future, for the bad or for the good. Who knows? But you might see me later. My business is normally about climate change and other related disasters. For the purpose of this course, I will talk about other disastrous things as we know from the course manual, because you have all read it, of course. But still stuff that is in my radar. It's good to know that you are alert. And if the last of you take a seat, we can start asking ourselves the question, because I'm a bit confused this week and it's Monday. What are we going to talk about today? Any ideas? Sorry? Integration and disintegration, yes. So this is more or less the fil rouge of the course, right? I mean, we're going to talk about how Europe has been integrated, is being integrated, or disintegrated. I have this task of like liaising you with also what other colleagues would talk about, I think next week, about disintegration. So I'm kind of between integration and disintegration here. Hopefully I will end up in one piece. But actually my sort of sense for this week is between trade and Brexit, okay? Which are also connected. So today, the topic is indeed integration and disintegration, but the topic is about trade, okay? The topic of today is about trade. Now, I take it you have different backgrounds, different interests, I guess. Not all of you are lawyers or want to be lawyers in the future. I am a lawyer. I'm a very boring lawyer, trained as a lawyer, educated as a lawyer, try to think less and less like a lawyer. So in that sense, I have a disclosure to make. There will be some slightly legalistic parts, and I will try to give you a warning when this happens, okay? And please give me feedback if you are completely lost, or if you're bored, or if you think this is bullshit. Just please tell me, okay? But I will try to keep it as low-key as possible for you, okay? Now, the menu for today is essentially the following. So we're going to look at how trade agreements in the EU context works and try to place it in this dynamic of integration and disintegration, because yes, I argue that trade agreements integrate and disintegrate at the same time. Secondly, and this is a bit of a legalistic part, we're going to talk about how trade is regulated. Again, very soaring over. But we're going to talk about the techniques that the EU adopts to come up with trade agreements. And then, what I find the juicy and updated part from last year, we're going to talk about the EU-Mercosur agreement. Have you heard of the Mercosur agreement? Sure enough, it was concluded last week, right? Just in time for us. So we're going to give you a bit of an update of what's happening there, because I think this is a clear example of kind of disintegration. And possibly just a light touch, again, on the legalistic aspects of competence. Who can sign what, and how is it important? Why is it important from the perspective of European integration? Are you happy with this menu? Good, because I am, so I'm going to go anyway. So, first of all, we're going to talk about trade. Now, who can define for us what trade means? In your own words. What is trade? Nobody? Okay, let's do a little game here. Okay, I see your hand raised. Some form of exchange. Yes, it's some form of exchange. I had a little bit of a game involved, if your colleague would not have raised his hands, but I have this for you. This is trade. You have something that another person likes, and vice versa. You exchange stuff, okay? And everybody's happy. So trade has been the means through which we have kept our civilization, our society, actually also at peace for many, many years. Business. Okay? I am a country that produces X, another country produces Y, I need X, I need Y, the other country needs X, we trade stuff, we make money, everybody's wealthier, everybody's happier, and we don't shoot each other, okay? So this is more or less how also Europe came about. European Union, I'm sorry, came up as an internal market, a place where things are exchanged, when things circulate, okay? So, in that sense, we have overcome that stage, and we are in a stage where Europe as a whole is now looking into trade with other countries outside its borders. Okay? So trade is nothing else but exchanging things. Now, if you are SpongeBob SquarePants and you want to sell your stuff, how is the other guy called? Don't remember. Patrick, yeah, Patrick, good call. Okay. If you want to exchange your stuff to Patrick, would you like to have economic barriers of any sort, like having to pay extra money to sell your pants to Patrick, or even to pay extra money to get the other stuff, or Patrick's pants? Yes or no? No, you don't want that. Why do I have to have economic barriers, like paying a tax, paying any kind of economic duty, that's what it's called, duty, on what I am exchanging with my neighbor? Huh? So the idea is that trade must be as free as possible. Free trade. Okay? When we talk about free trade, we talk about trade happening without any economic barrier, without duties, custom duties, for example, at the border. You want to import stuff, you go to the border, customs stop you. Have you paid your custom duties? No, I'm sorry, I'm going to fine you big time. And plus, you're going to pay your custom duties. But I'm a free space, man. No, you still have to pay this. This is against free market. Yeah, but who cares? I'm levying a custom duty anyway. You're not happy because you're paying more money and you're making less money. So the idea is that there must be as much free trade as possible, meaning trade without any economic barriers, without any taxes, without any tax levies, without any custom duties, without any tariffs. You have certainly heard of tariffs because of the guy from the White House. Remember the scene with the big board? Yeah? This is exactly what I'm talking about. If you want to bring your nice feta cheese to the United States from Greece, you're going to pay 10%, right? And maybe tomorrow morning I wake up, I say 20%, right? You're not going to be happy as a feta producer in Greece, right? Or a camembert producer in France, or as a, I don't know, Emmental. Emmental is not a great example. In any case, whatever you want. So the idea is that there must be as much free trade as possible. And this is what the EU is pursuing through free trade agreements. Okay? So the EU is signing agreements, international agreements, with selected states to ensure this, to ensure free exchange of goods, services, goods and services. Let's take it to this. Okay? This is what we're talking about. Legally, it's formulated in agreements. International agreements. Now, what is the problem, what is the deal with trade agreements? Ideally, they are very good because they make everybody happy. No barriers, no tariffs, no custom duties, no surprises, free goods everywhere, free feta for everyone, okay? Sounds great, okay? This is the quintessential construction of neoliberal economic order, okay? This is how we have constructed our society since the fall of the Berlin Wall, since the end of the Cold War. Free trade everywhere, okay? Free stuff everywhere. It has had its consequences globally, but now let's focus on the European dimension. I would say that trade agreements enhance, on the one hand, European integration. Why? As you see in the slide, both because internally, within the European Union space, they provide, ideally, competitiveness and benefits for all countries. If you have, let's say, more competitive products that are coming into the European market, the idea is that this will, for example, lead the European producers to produce at a lower cost, more effectively, more efficiently, competition, right? At the same time, we can export stuff, right? So if we open markets, like the Mercosur markets, a huge market, to our products without barriers, well, that's like golden, right? If you are a feta producer again, I can sell feta freely to all Brazil, to all Argentina, right? That's great. So this internally creates, ideally, a more cohesive, more competitive market, which is the core of the European construction, remember, the core of the European Union, okay? Externally, and this is the second dimension that I argue, you can think of others. I challenge you to think of others, of course. Externally, it's important because the way that the EU trade policy has been designed is meant to represent the European Union as one actor, not as 27 states negotiating 27 treaties. Is one actor, is the European Union, we will see how this happens, that negotiates these treaties, that sits at the table with the Mercosur bloc, with Vietnam, with whatever, with Canada, even with Donald Trump. We have seen this lately. They sit down and they talk trade as one bloc, not as 27 countries, which is interesting. Which is interesting in terms of, again, of ensuring one voice, which is the political way to foster integration nowadays. And this is the good side. Then I argue that there was also a bad side. And we've seen this as well, right? The bad side is, you know, we are always talking about the entity, which is the European Union, which operates as a whole, European Union, European Commission, Council, this stuff that you might have heard of, but also 27 member states. So how are member states represented in this process? It's good to have the European Union speaking with one voice, negotiating with Donald Trump, negotiating with China, Canada, Mercosur bloc. That's great. But how are all the 27 economies of the member states represented? How are feta producers, camembert producers, pecorino producers represented there? Because every country has got different economies, different industries, different economic interests. And remember this is very important in general, every member state has a degree of sovereignty over its own stuff, okay? So the EU exists only because member states have transferred sovereignty to the EU. Otherwise it would not exist. So member states are always, let's say, fond and very cautious about keeping up their sovereignty. And now what we're talking about is the European Union going on its own behalf to negotiate agreements that can impair, that can affect industries in Germany, France, Greece, Ireland, Italy, everywhere, right? So how do we make sure that member states are represented in this process? Because otherwise, you have what we've seen recently, for example, with the Mercosur agreement. Basically, you have cow shit in your office, because that's what's happened, okay? Farmers that go in front of your office, in front of a nice parliamentary building, or in front of your nice commission building and throw cow shit at you, okay? And they don't do it as a sport. Maybe somewhere it's also a sport, I don't know. But they don't do it as a sport. They do it because they're angry, okay? They do it because they think they're going to be undercut by this agreement. Okay, so this is clearly, you don't have to be great political scientists to understand that this is a politically sensitive issue that can fire a political backlash, okay? Second, also problematic and connected to that, the way in which decisions are taken are not always fully transparent. Again, the Commission sitting down with Donald Trump negotiating a sort of agreement on tariffs, one of the least transparent things that I've ever seen in my life. Okay? We don't know how they came up with this agreement. This is not even a trade agreement. This is kind of political deal, a kind of handshake. Trump likes this kind of stuff. This is the way it works. It doesn't like rules. It likes the kind of face-to-face fight. Completely untransparent. We don't know how this came about. We just came. So transparency and accountability is important if we want to be serious about the process of integration in these kind of things. But this is not always the case. So I have some videos for you because I want to keep you entertained. I assume you had your dose of food, but in any case, my voice is obviously boring. I have 2 videos that address the same issue from completely different perspective. Because one perspective that I omitted to mention, of course, is the perspective of, let's say, civil society concerns over these agreements that is connected to the lack of transparency. If you're negotiating an agreement, for example, with the Mercosur again, that talks about food products, or for example, wood products that are possibly produced thanks to deforestation, right? This kind of complex and concerning value chains, concerning from the perspective of human rights, from the perspective of environmental protection, from the perspective of climate change. This is where I come in. Many civil society bodies might be very much worried about what is happening there. What are you negotiating? What's the agenda there, right? And this is why you have had, and you have, on top of the farmers throwing cow shit at politicians, you also have civil society going into the streets to manifest, to protest openly against certain agreements. For example, the Canada-EU Comprehensive Trade Agreement, also called CETA. And this is why I want to show you 2 videos that sort of give you a completely different perspective of the same issue. So this video is a very institutional video, something that the European Commission likes to put out, where you will see interviews talking about the agreement, what's good, basically mostly what's good about the agreement. And another one would be a video by some NGOs talking about, of course, their views on the very same agreement. I would like you to check out the videos now, quickly, and sort of trying to pinpoint, trying to single out the buzzwords. So what is the refrain in these 2 videos? Because these are 2 narratives around the same agreement from completely different players. Let's see if this works. Obviously not. Wait. I need to work with the mic. Sound. Wait for it.
Most modern and advanced trade agreement ever made, actually. And it opens up fantastic possibilities for entrepreneurs and companies and consumers in Europe, but also in Canada. And it strengthens, of course, the very tight friendship and alliance we have with our Canadian friends.
Canada is our 12th trading partner. It's about 60 billion a year of trading goods, about a bit less than 30 billion trading services. It's a huge investor in Europe. There's more than 120 billion of Canadian euros of Canadian investment in Europe.
Nous sommes présents depuis une quinzaine d'années au Canada maintenant, ce qui représente environ 10% de notre chiffre d'affaires, avec environ 150 000 bouteilles à l'année. L'accord signé et négocié entre l'Union européenne et le Canada peut nous permettre d'améliorer nos échanges avec le Canada, dans le sens où on pourrait avoir plus de compétitivité. On est aussi beaucoup plus présent sur le marché canadien, donc on a une visibilité plus importante, on devient attractif pour le tourisme aussi, donc plus de personnes qui viennent sur Sancerre, on accueille énormément de clients canadiens qui aiment nos vins, donc tout ça reste très positif et très intéressant en termes d'échanges également humains avec le Canada.
Dredging equipment is excluded from the Coastal Trade Act by CETA, so that will help us to use our foreign equipment in Canada.
It's not our intention to take over the market of the local contractors, but it's our intention to join forces with them and to work together to bigger projects which were not feasible before.
Canada is a big country. Quantities to Canada are more important. Canadians are very fond of Italian PDO cheeses in general, Grana Padano and Parmigiano Reggiano in particular. I expect advantages from CETA agreement. We expect benefit to impact positively on turnover, new jobs and positive spillover on the communities where we are operating.
We have around 1,200 employees worldwide. Out of them, 1,000 are in Europe, around 700 are here in Germany. In Canada, the electrical approvals are different to the EU. This is for us a kind of a challenge since we have to adapt our products for the Canadian need. And this is increasing our prices, which makes us difficult to be competitive compared to local manufacturers. We believe that due to the CETA agreement, we can improve our situation. That means that we can increase our market share in Canada.
The Canadians have very similar view to the ones we have about not only the value of free trade and the free economy, but also how you should regulate that economy and how you should make sure that free trade does not damage public policy interests.
It simplifies access to the Canadian markets. We have access to their public procurement on all levels, and they're actually planning for a lot of investment in public procurement where we could bid. And it also makes it easier for our service companies to have access to the market and for the staff who work in the service companies to temporarily come and provide that service. And it also includes a very ambitious chapter on sustainable development, where we commit to together work on issues such as good environment, labor standards, etc.
Great promo. Okay. Can anybody single out for us some buzzwords that come out of this set of interviews, from the cheese guy to the super high-tech guy to the French winemaker? What do you take away from this? Just one word. Who said great? No, great? Yeah? Market share, okay. Thanks. I see something somewhere in the back. There was a hand raised. Yeah. Great? You said great? Yeah. Great is a challenging word nowadays. Depends on where you put it. Yeah, it's great. It's great to have more market share. Other stuff? Yeah. Accessibility to the market. Yes, it's great to have more accessibility to the market. Other thoughts? Yep. Creation of what? Jobs. Okay. Good. Creation of jobs. Yes. Competitiveness, of course, because I mean the high-tech guy was like, I mean, we cannot compete with the Canadians with this, but if we open up the business, then things are different, right? So okay. Other stuff? Yep. Benefiting. Say again. Benefiting in general, yeah. In terms of, I think, of economic benefits, also some sort of hinted some environmental benefits or social benefits, which I did a bit in the background. Yeah. This kind of idea that everybody will benefit. Yeah. Yep. Tourism? Yeah, more Canadians to the French wineries, right? Yeah. I mean, tourism is part of this. It's not necessarily the main focus of trade agreements, but depending on who you negotiate with, of course. This could be relevant from both the EU side and also the other contracting party side. Think about how many economies in the EU benefit mostly from tourism. Not that, wait, a trade agreement is not about freedom of movement of people. So if you are, I don't know, a Peruvian, or if you are Argentinian, or if you are a Vietnamese, for example, good example, if you're a Vietnamese, even if there is a free trade agreement in place, to come to visit the Parthenon in Greece, you still have to get your visa. It doesn't make things easier for you. Huh? But it makes things easier if you want to eat feta cheese. That's true. Other opinions, other buzzwords? I think we've covered quite some ground. Okay. So you see, this is the refrain around trade agreements. This is the sort of good side. And this is also how the Commission, the European Commission, sort of tries to do some PR around it. Okay? Now we have the other side, which is Friends of the Earth Europe.
raison de lutter et résister contre ces accords de libre-échange qui veulent sacrifier notre planète, sacrifier le climat, sacrifier l'agriculture, sacrifier l'emploi et sacrifier la démocratie.
Nous ne pouvons que déplorer que certains eurodéputés soient très sensibles aux pressions des lobbies.
Allez, on peut sauver la démocratie pour la jeunesse et pour la planète.
We have to start building a trade system that really works for people and for the environment.
Hoy estamos aquí para denunciar el fraude que significa este sistema democrático que está en crisis.
Aujourd'hui, plus de 400 députés européens ont voté en faveur du CETA, cet accord UE-Canada qui empêche la transition écologique et sociale. Mais ce n'est pas la fin de l'histoire puisque nous avons aujourd'hui la possibilité de mener bataille devant les parlements nationaux pour empêcher que cet accord ne voit jamais le jour.
Est-ce que vous serez là quand le CETA arrivera devant le Parlement national? Yes or no?
Nous allons tout faire pour que la France ne ratifie pas le traité et le mettre en échec. Nos amis européens peuvent compter sur nous et nous comptons sur eux pour qu'ils en fassent de même.
Okay, again, these are two sides of the same coin in a way. So what are the buzzwords here? What are the buzzwords here from Friends of the Earth? What is the main claim? Yeah. Democracy, yeah, that's a big one. Lobby, that's another big one, yeah. Something else? Yeah. Environment, yeah, that's another one. Yeah. Agriculture, sure. Other stuff? Well, I think we've covered some ground. So the main argument here is that, you know, these trade agreements only serve some parts of the society, right? They are not going to deliver the social, environmental benefits that we need to shape our society. Of course, there is a bit of ideology in this. I mean, fight against free trade has always been there since the 90s. But here, the argument is really that these agreements bypass many, potentially can bypass many, you know, social contracts that we have developed in Europe. And can be dangerous to that. And can ultimately be also dangerous for democracy in the end. And of course, there is the lobbying part, which is important. How do we come up with these agreements? Who is behind these agreements? Which industries are behind these agreements? Who is benefiting more? This is also a problem of transparency and accountability. This is why I put transparency and accountability in the slide, right? So, and the last point I want to convey to you based on this video, if you paid attention, in the very end of the video, at the very end, they mention something is mentioned at the very end. Remember? Yeah. Yeah. Yes, there's a lady who says, where will you be when your national parliament will be asked to ratify the CETA agreement? Will be asked to incorporate the CETA agreement. This is the sort of dynamic that I want to explain to you. There is a legal background to it, of course, and I want to drive you through it quickly in a moment. But you have to think, if this dynamic, think of the national versus EU dimension. We have an agreement, the CETA, that has been signed by the EU, and then we have people now that go on the street and say, we are going to look at our national parliaments in all our states, and we're going to fight in the streets to make sure that our national parliament will not be okay with this. Somebody says, we're going to make all our best to make sure that France does not get along with this agreement. So there is this dynamic that has to be taken into consideration for us in this room, between the European level of things and the national level of things. And these levels, more and more often, when it comes to trade agreements like CETA or like Mercosur agreement, they conflict. They are not on the same page. And this can, in my view, lead to less integration, okay? In fact, what happened in real life with the CETA deal was that the Belgian parliament, Belgians are very active on these things, the Walloon parliament in particular, the French-speaking part, actually rejected the CETA deal. This called a stalemate for a very long time. Because, of course, Belgium is a great country. I mean, Belgium has got 4 parliaments, 4 regions. It's you know, anybody from Belgium here? Never mind. It's a complicated country. I worked there for 4 years. It's amazing. I studied the legal system. It's amazing. So if you have an international agreement, it has to be ratified by 4 parliaments. It's crazy. So one parliament said, maybe we don't like this agreement. Okay, everything stopped. Okay? Everything stopped because, I mean, then you need to have consensus of all the member states, and Belgium is a particularly difficult one because it's not 1 state, it's 4 states, or 3 at least. So, in any case, what is, therefore, the tension? What is the tension that trade agreements trigger? And why is it important? If you look at the 2 videos, this is how I will summarize it again. You did a perfect job, amazing job for me, and thank you for that. Basically, on the one hand, we have the arguments for efficiency, for liberalization, for standard setting. By setting free trade agreements, we go on level playing field. That's the word that the Commission loves. Level playing field, okay? Everybody on the same footing, everybody on the same page, same standards, fair competition, fair and equal, nobody cheating, okay? This is the great argument. That is an argument which is super in line with the European Union. Because the European Union is a technocracy. The European Union is a neoliberal construct, whether you like it or not, okay? So this is a 101 European Union argument. On the other side, we have the arguments about, I would say, accountability and democracy. How much these agreements affect democracy at the European level, at the domestic level of member states. How much these agreements undermine public participation. How much these agreements ultimately erode transparency. These are the tensions that we have. This is how I will frame the discussion around European integration when it comes to free trade agreements. In the middle of this, of course, there's money. Because free trade agreements is money for someone. Okay? Now, maybe I have a couple of legal stuff for you. I'm not fully sure, not yet. But I'm going to skim through this very quickly because I think you have mentioned this with Peter in the first week. I've talked a bit of history of trade, right? Kind of. I just want to recap and just want to mention to you that historically speaking, trade has always been, however, an important policy of the European Union. Okay? Trade liberalization is there since the Treaty of Rome, 1957, since the very first treaty that established the European Economic Community. Okay? Then became the European Community, then became the EU. So there's always been the idea that, again, we have to create an internal market, that we need internal liberalization, and we need a common view on trade in the European space. Therefore, what is called the common commercial policy, which is the buzzword, the sort of legal buzzword you want to put in there, common commercial policy is the sort of joint view, joint policy of the EU towards trade, towards liberalization of trade. It has been there since the 50s, okay? Because trade, internally and externally, is the raison d'être de the EU. Bad French spelling there, of course, but apologies for that. But ultimately, the EU is really geared around trade. So I want to just convey the message that trade has always been a key objective of the EU. And normally, the champion of this, so the agent that is pursuing this view, that is operationalizing this, enforcing it, I would also say, is the European Commission. Okay? So if you have to look to someone, when it comes to the common commercial policy, the trade policy of the EU, that is the European Commission. That is the player when it comes to trade agreements and trade policy. Okay? Because the EU, of course, moreover, over decades, has become a powerful, very important trade partner, trade market. Believe me, I will say this comfortably. I don't care. I can be challenged anytime. But the only reason why Europe makes sense in the current geopolitical scenario is because we have this. We are consumers. We are a big market. Okay? If you think about how the world is being shaped right now, the only reason why Europe still makes sense is exactly this. We have a big market, and people want our market. China wants our market. Donald Trump wants our market in his own way. So this is why for Europe, trade is so important. It's fundamental. It's existential. It's becoming an existential element by now. Okay? If you read the famous Brussels effect by Andrew Bradford, this is explained very clearly. So the EU needs to act together. And this is more or less how it looks. Since we are a big, fat, good market, we go to negotiate with our, just like this, basically. With a big tie, big tie, big handshake, large shoulders, very masculine metaphor, of course. But this is how more or less every agreement is done. Because the EU, by acting as one, essentially, it's really capable of driving most of the negotiations. Most of the negotiations. For the good and for the bad, again. So you have to think about, EU negotiating a trade agreement, again, with Vietnam. Do you think there is power balance there? Do you think there is a clear negotiation balance, level playing field in the negotiations there? Obviously not. The EU is calling the shots. The EU is saying, okay, this is my market. This is a big market. You want my market because you want to export your products. We are not looking at similar economies, looking at similar fundamentals here. This is not a super equal playing field of negotiations. This is why the EU has never been able to negotiate a trade agreement with the US. Never. The only agreement that has been done is with the Trump administration now because of the tariffs, the board threat. And so we had to sit down and discuss things. But the US has always been unwilling to negotiate or to conclude a trade agreement with the EU. Because then you don't have this. You have two, still masculine, big guys or, large shoulder people negotiating. So, but again, from the perspective of the EU, this is good. Because on the one hand, you consolidate the internal market by negotiating agreements with the third countries. So, you expand your market, you export more stuff out there, you import also stuff. So you consolidate the market. You achieve somehow deeper economic and political integration, ideally, because money makes everybody happy, with the asterisk and the caveat that we have seen before. And this also stimulates, supports more enlargement of the EU. Think about new countries. When new countries access the EU, now we're talking about a new wave of enlargement now, a very tricky one, but we are going into that direction. Also topic for this course. Of course, having trade agreements in place that liberalize the market is great from the perspective of countries that want to join the business. And then, of course, there is the external factors to which the EU contributes, because again, the EU is neoliberal construction. And these are neoliberal views of the world that we see. Expanding the world economy, less barriers to trade, less tariffs, more free trade, more expansion of the world economy. Less barriers to trade, less barriers between Canada, the EU, China, Vietnam, South Africa, Mercosur bloc. Bigger expansion of the global value chains, stuff that is produced across the globe, because this is a result of globalization of the 90s, okay? We have globalized our world. The stuff that we have, the laptops, our clothes, everything we have is not produced in one single place. It's produced across complex value chains. So the more we lift barriers to this, the more ideally we expand these value chains. At the same time, ideally, also this would lead to emergence of new economic powers, because more money being pouring into one economy, Vietnam's economy, Indonesia economy, South African economy, Brazilian economy. Ideally, this would lead to economic growth, economic development, rise of new economic powers, which is interesting in this particular context. Because, of course, here we are seeing the consolidation of powers by certain players. whereas certain other players are starting to arise. Let me check the time. 1:40. We're doing quite nice. Any questions about that or any thoughts? You see, I haven't talked about law yet. Almost. Okay? This is why you're still attentive. That's great. But I got legal stuff. It will come maybe after the break. I just wanted to show you an overview. So this is the size of the deal when it comes to the European trade agreements. Okay? So excluding the blue part, which is of course the EU and the customs union, so the area, the sort of internal market, right? And the customs union, which includes also other countries, as you can see, not only EU countries. Just focus on the reddish ones, the orange ones, and the yellow ones. Okay? So these parts are either trade agreements that already exist, or trade agreements that are being adopted, or the yellow one, trade agreements that are being negotiated. Okay? So this is the level of reach that the EU has managed to get in the last 30 years, or even more. The acceleration happened definitely in the last 30, 20 years. Now, because of Mercosur, topic for after the break, that all South American bloc is going to turn red because the agreement has been signed. And technically is entering into force. Actually, 1 week before Mercosur, a bit under the radar news, an agreement with India was concluded. So in a range of 2 weeks, we have concluded a free trade agreement with India and a free trade agreement with all the South American bloc, as the European Union, I mean. So you can see that the EU is basically negotiating with almost everyone. Well, with Russia, you don't want to negotiate nowadays, obviously, right? Not even with the Arabic countries too much, because they have other business. Venezuela, the whole deal. So we see that the strategic interest of the European Union, you can see where this is located. This is geoeconomics as well. I'm not an expert on this, but certainly it is connected. Trade is connected also to that. And you can see that there is a yellow dot on the United States. Why? Because there has been, for years, the TTIP, the famous transatlantic partnership or whatever. That was this kind of long-awaited deal that ultimately was sank under the first Trump administration. And so it would not definitely materialize now. So you can see that the EU has gotten pretty far in terms of establishing specific trade agreements with specific countries or specific group of countries. I would say we pause this here with the warning that after the break there will be a slight salt and pepper of legal stuff. Hopefully this would not refrain you from coming back. Any questions? Are you still alive with me? Okay, good. So I would say we meet in 15, right? Okay, folks. Take your seat, please. Your attention, please. How are we doing? Good. Okay, that's already louder than before. Okay. Hope you rested your minds and brains. Because now I'm going to talk a bit about the common commercial policy, if you are okay with this. And if you're not, I'm going to do it anyway. Okay? Any questions about what we said so far? Reflections, comments? Trump is an idiot. Yes, he is. I'm not going to enter the US anymore. Well, who cares? Okay. Now, so we have set the scene a lot. But hopefully, all the stuff that I've thrown at you helps you thinking about the issue, framing the issue. I'm going to try to put a bit of a legal spices on it, okay? Now, before we talk about Mercosur. So, when it comes to the sort of policy, again, that encapsulates everything that I mentioned so far, trade agreements, trade deals and all that, in EU law, we talk about common commercial policy, okay? CCP. Not CCCP, because that's another thing that's in the past, and, we don't want to open that box. CCP, Common Commercial Policy, okay? It refers to the rules, regulations, mechanisms, structures that governs agreements between, trade agreements, between the EU and third countries. Okay? Third countries. When I say third country, I mean every country that is not party to the EU. Okay? This is what we call as third countries. So, for example, the US is a third country, Vietnam is a third country, but Albania is also a third country, okay? Just to give a close example. So, the idea, the goal is that we promote, of course, European values, we promote competitiveness, we promote European integration, all the nice stuff that I said before, ensuring fair and transparent deals. But importantly, again, I would not stress this enough, the idea is that the common commercial policy reflects a unified approach, ensures that the EU speaks with one voice when it comes to trade deals. So, unified approach for the European Union as a whole. And this means, therefore, in legal terms, this means that the EU has got exclusive competence over trade. Exclusive competence, okay? Only the EU can negotiate trade deals. Not France, not Germany, not Ireland, not the Netherlands, not Slovakia, not Malta, just the EU, okay? Only the EU. This is important. This is very, from a legal perspective, also from a sort of governance perspective, okay? The idea is also that, of course, the CCP promotes a rules-based system, which is now more important than ever when we have other players that don't care about the rules anymore. They care about another system that's not necessarily based on the rules. It aims to protect the core values of the EU, because the EU is not only the market, it's also about some values. Maybe we talked about this. But the idea is that we project these values also outside the European Union, and we work with solidarity and cohesion across the EU, internally, when we negotiate trade deals, and also when we negotiate, when we go abroad, when we sit down with negotiating partners. Now, again, I would not stress this enough from a legal perspective. This translates into a couple of articles in the treaty, in the EU treaties. You don't have to remember this by heart, of course. Please do not. But just remember that, again, the common commercial policy is an exclusive competence of the European Union. So only the European Union can negotiate trade agreements. And this is Article 3 of the Treaty of the European Union, the EU, which you're going to come across, whether you like it or not. And then you have other two articles, 207, 216 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, TFEU, that regulate the way in which agreements are done, essentially. And the 207 says that essentially all the trade agreements fall within the scope of the common commercial policy. And the 216 says that, in the markup part, that the agreements that are concluded by the European Union are binding upon all the member states. So once an agreement is concluded, okay, an agreement is concluded by the European Union, this is binding on all the 27 member states. From Hungary, to Spain, to Portugal, to Greece, to Finland. This is what the treaty says. And then the Court of Justice has also built on this, case law on this. And importantly, especially, they have said that once agreements are concluded, they are integral part of the EU legal order, which legally means that they are part of EU law as such, just like, regulations, directives, all the myriads of the rules that the EU produces every day and that they creep on every aspect of our life. Also, trade agreements become part of this puzzle, legally speaking. This is important because the message I want to convey to you is that trade agreements become, therefore, also part of the legal framework of the member states as well. It's a kind of symbiosis that happens here, okay? So whenever, whatever a government will come to you and say, we are sovereign, we don't care about EU law and blah, blah, blah. The counter argument is a legal one and says, look, EU law is also part of your legal order, part of your country, whatever. Our system, our legal system, and trade agreements as well. This is important because, especially for trade agreements, this is a step up that has been achieved exactly because the EU recognized the need to work with one voice. And I have a small video for you because, of course, this can be confusing, especially if your level of education in certain things is not super high. Because, of course, when you think about Europe, you think of 27 states. You think of different industrial powers: Germany, France, Italy. The UK in the past. You think of Spain. You think of 27 different economies, but then you end up negotiating with one bloc. Now, this can be confusing.
And even the world leaders that Trump has been fighting with seem alarmed by how little he understands trade. EU chief Jean-Claude Juncker reportedly met Trump armed with a series of colourful, simple flashcards to explain the trade war. And the word that really gets me there is colourful. Because that means that they had some simple flashcards and thought, no, too wonky, let's get some big fun baby colours on those things. Let's give him a chance. And Angela Merkel struggled to explain something even more basic.
The Independent newspaper, citing an unnamed senior German official, 10 times Trump asked Ms. Merkel if he could negotiate a trade deal with Germany. Every time she replied, you can't do a trade deal with Germany, only the EU. On the 11th refusal, Trump finally got the message, oh, we'll do a deal with Europe then.
So he understood, but only after the 11th refusal. Just listen to what that sounds like. Deal with Europe, huh? 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 Deal with Europe. Oh, okay, I'll deal with Europe then. Honestly, I'm just amazed that after the 5th time, Angela Merkel didn't turn to her translator and say, okay, you're fucking fired. You can't possibly be translating this right.
Okay, so that's not, again, a straightforward situation to deal with. Because, again, you have to think of the European Union as one of the real blocks that exist. The US negotiate trade as one entity in their own way. India, China, they all negotiate as one entity. The EU is not really, is one entity, but at the same time representing 27 member states. So it's not a straightforward thing to understand. Of course, if your level of, way of doing things is not too elevated, you can end up with these funny situations as reported. But in any case, I would really like you to think about also the fact that this is legally secured and this is legally part of the European architecture. And there are different actors involved in this. Again, you don't have to remember all this, but just remember that, of course, who is in the driving seat, again, when it comes to negotiating agreements, are the European institutions, not the member states. I assume you are all more or less acquainted with these names. if I talk about European Commission, if I talk about Council, if I talk about Parliament. Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay. So this is the procedure to sign an international trade agreement in plain words, okay? So first thing that happens is that the Council, which represents the member states, the different governments of the member states, decides to launch the negotiations. So in fact, nothing happens without the initiative of the member states. I said that the Commission is the champion of the negotiation. This is true. But the procedure only starts by initiative of the Council, which represents the member states, the governments of the member states. Then once the Council has launched the negotiation, has adopted the decision to open the negotiations, then the Commission steps in. The people with the big tie or the big dresses and stuff, they come and negotiate stuff with the third country, right? Why the Commission? Well, first because the Commission has this task under the treaties to do that. Second, because it's got the expertise to do that. They got tough negotiators, they got people that know trade, that have been doing this for a while, very boring bureaucrat people, but they know their deal. So they go and discuss, okay? And they negotiate for how long as it takes. Then when the deal is done, negotiations are over, the Council authorizes the signing of the agreement. So this goes back to the representatives of the member states at the European level. So basically it circles back, the Council agrees, says, okay, we are good with this agreement. Then this goes to the European Parliament, which is the only democratically elected body in this picture here, the European Parliament. And the European Parliament gives consent to the agreement. So it puts kind of rubber stamp on the agreement. We agree with this, we consent this agreement to enter into force, to exist, and then the Council finally ratifies this agreement. Why do we have this procedure? Why do we have this procedure? Because we want to ensure that both the European Union as a whole, through the Commission, but also the member states, through the Council, are involved in this process. We want to ensure that somehow governments have a say on the process at some point. And they do have it at least twice. In the beginning, when they say, okay, let's negotiate with these people, let's negotiate with Mercosur, let's negotiate with Vietnam, with India, and in the end, when they say, okay, I am happy with this agreement or I'm not. This is the process, the point of the sort of entry points where we have an intervention or a role of the member states, however, as represented in the Council. Do you see national parliaments involved in this process? No. National parliaments are not involved in this process. So all this falls for now, because it will come handy in a moment. Now, this system has been proven functional because the EU, as you saw before, has concluded tons of agreements in this way. It's, of course, this is for the reading, I think, in the readings that I assign you for this lecture. It has some drawbacks and upsides in relation to the sort of diagram between efficiency and accountability, of course. As I said, national parliaments are not represented in this process. Only the EU negotiates the deal. Member states do not have a say. They don't have a say in what is negotiated. Only the Commission negotiates this. So the contents of the agreement is only dealt with by the Commission, not by the states, not by the Council. The Council only says, okay, go ahead. And in the end, they say, okay, I like it, I don't like it. But what happens in between, the Council, member states, they don't have a say on it. So obviously, there is a matter of how do we ensure the balance between an effective system that ensures trade deals are done in time and in a good way, and a system that is accountable, a system that ensures accountability between the EU and the member states and its citizens, the farmers, the cheese producers, the wine producers, the whatever, okay? This is the problem that I tried to highlight before. I think the piece by Idil Alkas that I have assigned, if I'm not mistaken, navigates this as well. And again, one last legalistic point for you. How does the EU navigate this kind of tension? What is the technique that the EU uses to navigate this tension? This is called mixed agreements. Mixing, right? Shake it, shake it, shake it, right? You do mixed agreements. This is what the EU is doing. This is what Mercosur also is. This is what CETA is as well, the agreement with Canada. Mixed agreements are agreements that involve both provisions, so contents, that fall under the exclusive competence of the EU, so it's only stuff that the EU can negotiate on, but also other topics, other issues that fall as a shared competence, so something that the EU and the member states can legislate on. So one thing that the EU definitely can exclusively negotiate on is trade of goods. Anything that is related to eliminating barrier to trade, that's EU stuff, 100%, no matter what, that's clear. But, for example, provisions that relate to environmental protection, standards for sustainability of products, that's not 100% barriers to trade. That's about standards on how sustainable your stuff is. That is a kind of provision that might be considered as a shared competence provision, something that the EU can negotiate on, but member states can also legislate on. This is how the treaties works. For example, on environmental protection, there is shared competence, as they say. The EU can legislate, but also the member states. So if you have very complex agreements like CETA or Mercosur agreement, they will talk about both. They will talk about barriers to trade, how to remove tariffs, and they will talk about sustainability standards for products. Both things. This is why it becomes a mixed agreement. This is how it becomes a mixed agreement. Okay? You have some stuff that is exclusively on the hands of the European Union, and you have some stuff that is shared between the states, the member states, and the European Union. This is what we call a mixed agreement. You with me on this? What is the problem and what is the challenge with this kind of agreement? Well, there is also an advantage. The advantage is you are bringing somehow the member states on board in this. But you have to sometimes, because if you want to talk about environmental stuff, the treaties tell you you have to involve the member states. You cannot go ahead 100% on your own. So you have to. In this sense, you have more involvement, buy-in of member states. At the same time, you also lose on the efficacy part, right? Because what happens concretely is that at the end of this process, the agreement, once it's negotiated, concluded, everybody's happy at the European level, the agreement must be ratified by each and every single 27 member states' parliaments. Belgium's got 4, so you got over 30. And that's what happens with CETA. Then the balloons wake up and say, we don't like this agreement. We don't like the sustainability provisions that you put in there. That would damage our industry. Or we don't like the provisions on agriculture that you put in there because that would damage our farmers, right? And they stop the agreement. So there is, let's say, benefits and let's say, challenges in doing that. But this is what the EU has been doing with all the big agreements that we know. This is the only way to go about it. Okay? Then one might also distinguish between facultative and mandatory mixity. So sometimes the EU chooses to do a mixed agreement. Sometimes it's actually mandatory. It really depends on the contents of the agreement. But just remember mixity, mixology. Shake it, okay? We mix the agreement, we blend it, so that we make sure that we cover as much ground as possible. And somehow also we involve the member states in the process. So we dilute, essentially, the exclusive competence of the EU with the goal of covering more grounds in the context of the agreement that we negotiate. So, for example, talking about environmental standards, labor standards, agricultural products, and stuff like that. But at the same time, also exposing this process to challenges. And this is where the possible disintegration might happen. And this is where I come to the Mercosur agreement, okay? The EU-Mercosur agreement. Do you know when the negotiations of the EU-Mercosur agreement actually started? They were concluded officially 10 days ago or something. Or maybe a bit earlier. Let's say 15 days, 20 days, I don't know what day is today. Let's say 1 month ago. Do you know when they actually started? Any guess? Just strike a number. Yep. Close. close. Well, I put more than 35 years. 1999, okay, was, I think, most of us, I was there in 1999. I remember 1998 is the first World Cup that I remember clearly. Italy lost against France, penalty kicks. I very clearly noticed it, so this speaks to my capacity of will, you know. The 1994, I could not remember anything. So 1998, the first kernel of memory comes to me. In 1999, this guy starts negotiating an agreement that was concluded 20 days ago. 25 years, more than 25 years of negotiations. And finally, we are here in Paraguay, holding our hands. Everybody's happy. You see Antonio Costa, President of the Council of the European Union. You see Ursula von der Leyen. Of course, you should recognize this person, President of the European Commission. You see all the leaders, including the chainsaw guy. Where is the chainsaw guy? You know, the Milei, the Argentinian guy. You know, all these guys. Everybody happy, holding their hands. Great. And this was, again, when was this? There is a date somewhere there. I think it was mid-January. Okay? Finally, we got an agreement. This went on again for decades. And again, summarizing the story of Mercosur is impossible in 20 minutes that we have. But I just want to say that there has been a lot of bumps in the road. Negotiations have been stalled for a very long time. Then they rebooted over the last few years, especially after COVID. And especially for what is interesting for us is that, of course, also because of the pushback and because of the noise being made by civil society organizations and by farming organizations, farmers, at some point we were witnessing a clear political split-up in the European Union. Essentially on the edge of diplomatic, tension between Berlin and Paris, between Germany and France, right? Especially France was very vocal in not getting a green light to the agreement. France didn't want the agreement because the farming population, the farmers, not the winemakers, the farmers were not happy with this agreement. They say, look, if we sign this agreement, we're going to have a flood of products coming from the Mercosur countries, agricultural products that will come at a very low price. We are inputting a huge amount of food and other products that are competing with us. I mean, we have costs. You want good cheese, you pay for it, right? But if you can get some very good cheese from Brazil or from Paraguay with a very lower cost, that would essentially undermine our business. And the same for other agricultural products, meat, for example, right? Meat products. This is the main criticism, essentially. Now, again, as a politician, you don't want to have farmers throwing cow shit at the Elysee. It doesn't look nice, this kind of super imperial building being covered by cow shit. People are not happy in Paris to see tractors everywhere, again, manure everywhere, people that set things on fire. When things happen in France, normally some fire catches up, That's how it goes, since those times, right? So people don't want that. You don't want that as a national politician. So Macron was a bit, between, not in a very nice place to be. Because on the same time, of course, it was green lighting, he was pursuing the agreement at the European level, but he had also to talk to the farming people in his own country. So at some point, France really put the barricades on. This is not a random metaphor. They put the barricades on and say, look, we are not going to sign this agreement. We are not going to go for this. And of course, politically, this is important because France, Germany, Italy, whether you like it or not, these are countries that politically have a significant weight. And we're seeing this now in the European Union. Okay? If France stands up and says, I'm not getting along with this, this is not a marginal statement. This is something that triggers political turmoil, triggers discussions. Okay? France and Germany have been quite aligned for many years during the last decade. Mercosur was one of the agenda items that sort of tore them a bit apart, drifted them apart politically. And new alliances were formed. So, for example, Germany and Italy were very strong supporters of the Mercosur agreement. France remained the very last one until, early January. that really didn't want to ratify, didn't want to agree, didn't want to give the green light to the agreement in the Council. So this is something that we must think about as an example of dimensions, dynamics that are triggered by agreements like the EU-Mercosur. Now, in the end, this is the update. What happens was that Macron had a wake-up call and said, okay, our government is going to agree with the EU-Mercosur agreement. Again, my interpretation of this is that there was too much pressure at the political level, in the European level, for this agreement to be signed. We have to think that early January 2026, the US kidnapped a president of a state. Whether, okay, bad guy, whatever you think about him. We are in a world that didn't look like a super safe place. The EU really wanted to establish a rule-based order. So they see this as a means to counter a way of doing things that is not based on the rules, it's based on something else. And trade agreements are one way to do this. This is how I formulate it, at least in my own view. You can make me accountable for my own view. So in the end, France say yes. So the agreement is signed. The agreement is finalized as per the procedure that we saw before. So the Council agrees with the agreement. What happens immediately after? This, right? We have Irish farmers that show up with these signs. We have, this is French farmers. We have Spanish farmers that go in the street with tractors. And I want to really think, I like this picture here with the Irish ones. Because think about, this is so powerful, I think. Okay, it's not, of course, I think, the vision of all the farmers in Ireland. But you can see how visceral the reaction could be to this kind of situations. What is the immediate reaction that you can have? It's like, oh, fuck the European Union. They're going to make an agreement that will make somebody rich and will screw up my business, right? How is this good for my business? How is this good for my country? How is this good for my people, right? This is a very dangerous political spin that you can get yourself into, okay? And this is not only Ireland, this is again France, it was Italy for a while, Greece, blockades in highways for weeks, but there was also the internal matter. I mean, farmers are never happy, but I understand them to some extent. In any case, it is a big problem. It is a real deal. And how did the EU deal with it? As you remember from the previous slide on the procedure, once the Council agrees on the text, so the governments of the states have agreed on this goes to the European Parliament. The European Parliament is composed by members of the Parliament, people elected by the farmers also, right? By us, by the farmers, whoever can vote. The European Parliament said, no, wait. I'm not going to consent to this. I'm not going to give the rubber stamp to this. Wait a minute. People are angry, things are not really in order here. So what the European Parliament did was referring the text of the agreement to the Court of Justice in Luxembourg. And they say, we want the Court of Justice to look into the text of the agreement, and we want to see if the agreement has been signed according to the rules. If everything that is in there is actually being negotiated, being discussed according to the rules of the game. Whether, in other words, if the European Union had the competence to negotiate everything that they had negotiated on with the Mercosur bloc. Of course, especially with regard to certain rules that dealt with agricultural products, because you have this. The very latest news, actually, is that the European Parliament has also adopted a piece of legislation that compensates, it's a very weird mechanism that I didn't have time to study, but essentially the bottom line is a sort of compensation mechanism for farmers that basically stops inflow of goods if this would drag down the prices too much. So essentially, it mitigates the risk that farmers have, that, we have too many products coming from Mercosur bloc, too many meat products, too many food products, or too many whatever, that will drag down the prices, that will ruin our business. Basically, it's a kind of emergency brake that the European Parliament has approved that will basically stop inflow of products if this is how to say, affecting too much the European market. That's more or less the idea. That's the very latest news. Let's see how it goes. And then, just to tell you also what trade means nowadays, interesting news that I heard a couple of days ago. We have Mercosur. What does Donald Trump do? He goes to the mustache chainsaw guy in Argentina and negotiates a separate deal. This is funny. Because, so essentially, according to this deal, you have preferential treatment for food products that come from the United States. Now, essentially, according to this agreement, now Argentina is part of the Mercosur bloc. So Argentina is part of this EU-Mercosur agreement. So now, you know, feta, camembert, wine, French wine, Italian wine can pour into Argentina freely. But according to this agreement now that Trump has just signed with the other guy, Milei, now also products, similar products produced in the United States, have completely free entry to the Argentinian market. So of course feta cheese comes from Greece, right? The original one. But now, also feta cheese produced in Wisconsin has completely free entrance to the Argentinian market, which is a threat, which is a clear threat to especially certain products that are produced in the EU and that were, of course, at the core material interest of the Mercosur agreement. Just as the latest development that I want to show to you, that of course, there is economics, but there is a lot of geoeconomics and geopolitics involved in this. The EU signs a deal with the Mercosur agreement. Trump goes to one of his most closest allies, Milei, who is also, by the way, sitting in the one and only Board of Peace for Gaza, right? Next to the president of FIFA, Gianni Infantino, you know, the football guy, and negotiates a specific agreement only to undermine certain European denomination of products, like feta. Okay? This is what is happening, just to give you the facts. You can put any kind of perspective you want, but this is more or less what is happening. We have 10 minutes. Okay, probably we're going to have to pick it up from tomorrow, but that's fine. Okay, I anticipated there will be some last legal spices towards the end. I have to mention this because it is connected to what is happening today. So, we said that the European Parliament stopped the process of entering into force of the Mercosur agreement. Because they said, we want to look into this, we want the Court of Justice to look into this. We want the judges to look into this, okay? So what is the technically speaking, what is the question here? So the question is, or the issue is, that the way the EU went about the EU-Mercosur agreement is actually splitting up the agreement in two. So we have an EU-only agreement that has been signed already. So what has been signed between the Mercosur and the EU is a provisional agreement. Is a provisional agreement that doesn't have to go through the member states. It doesn't have to be ratified by the member states. That applies, again, provisionally from tomorrow until sometime. At some point, there will be another agreement that is called the final mixed agreement. The EU has done this before. For example, in agreement with Chile that is being discussed. This is the technique they use also. This is also mixity, in a way, as we talked before. Mixity, right? So, EU-only agreement first. Agreement only for the EU, only signed by the EU, not passing by the national parliament. Let's bypass, the Élysée, let's bypass the Bundestag, let's bypass the parliaments and stuff. And then there will be a final mixed agreement. So an agreement that will have to be ratified also by the national parliaments. Now, the European Parliament is challenging this interim agreement. This interim agreement, as they say that this is incompatible with a set of principles, a series of principles, important one for those of you who will go into EU law in the future, the principle of conferral that says that the EU can only legislate as far as the treaty says so. And also importantly, they say there is a possible violation of institutional balance and sincere cooperation. Why? Because this technique, splitting up in an interim agreement and then going for a final agreement, essentially prevents national parliaments from having the legitimate say on the agreement. Reformulated in plain words, this kind of technique undermines the proper functioning, institutional functioning of the European Union. It bypasses or it circumvents the way that we see things going in the European Union between member states and the European Union itself. Because basically what you say is, look, we have finalized this agreement, we have signed this deal, we have no time to lose. Let's put this agreement out there for the moment. Then we will see. Then maybe in the future we will get a new deal, a final deal, and the parliaments will have their say on it. The European Parliament is saying, this doesn't look like fair game to me. This doesn't look like institutionally balanced, This doesn't look like sincere cooperation. If you will talk about the European Union law, you will hear sincere cooperation, because member states, European institutions, they have to cooperate, sincerely, loyalty, right? Trust. This is how the European Union is glued together. Trust, sincere loyalty, and cooperation. This stuff, according to the European Parliament, the way that the European Union is doing here, the Commission primarily, is actually not really in line with this. And especially the fact that, ultimately, you are bypassing national parliaments. This, of course, is not surprising. It's not surprising that this comes from the Parliament, the European Parliament. Right? This is not surprising. We talked about democracy before. The European Parliament is an institution that represents citizens. This is what I say in every first lecture of the EU law course that I co-coordinate. The European Commission is not representing European citizens. The European Commission is representing the European Union. This is different. The European Council, or the Council, is not necessarily representing the citizens directly. They represent governments with their own agendas, their own political views, their own economic and social priorities. The Parliament is the only institution that represents individuals, because they have been elected by individuals, right? They have been elected by all of us in a relatively, hopefully, democratic way, okay? So this is not surprising that the European Parliament comes up with this, because they say, look, we are interested in what is happening on the ground, and we see that this kind of agreement has some implications for the functioning of the European Union as a whole, and you shall not bypass national parliaments in this. They don't give me the bullshit, we are doing provisional agreement and then we will see. No. I want to know exactly if you are doing things by the rule book here. And this is the question that is being posed by the European Parliament to the Court of Justice of the European Union. Okay? So this is the latest developments. So an opinion will come out of the Court of Justice about this. This will probably pause the agreement for a while, because you have to wait for the court to come up with a response. What can I say about it in the last 5 minutes that we have is that this has happened before, okay? Again, don't need to read all these things. Just listen to me for the next 5 minutes. This has happened before. The Court of Justice has been requested to issue an opinion about the validity of, in this case, it was the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. More or less on the same grounds, like what could the EU do, what could the EU not do, is this going down by the rules, is this something that the EU could negotiate on its own, or is it something that had to be ratified by all member states? How does this work? How does this mixity work here? Is it legal mixity or is it unlawful mixity? What I can tell you here, the Court of Justice issued an opinion, that was in 2015, 10 years ago, basically saying, well, legally speaking, as we have said before, everything that relates to trade, everything that relates to barriers to trade, is something that the EU can negotiate exclusively, right? But now, what is trade? This is the original question. What is trade? And if you look at the opinion of the court about the Singapore Agreement, they say, well, we can say that, for example, sustainability standards for product, this also relates to trade. Because if we have the same standards for your products, what are you producing? Pesticides? Okay, I'm producing pesticides. Not great stuff, but okay, it's big money, right? So, you know, it's good that we have the same standards over here because that facilitates trade. This is not about the environment. This is about my colleague, your name again? Minya. This is me and Minya having better trade because we have the same standards, okay? Forget about the sustainability thing. It's about, you know, removing a barrier to trade, which is the fact that we have different standards. You see how we can interpret things in different ways? So basically what the court did in the occasion of the Singapore Agreement, that has a chapter, that has a set of rules dedicated to sustainable development, just like the Mercosur Agreement, they basically say trade is pretty much everything, right? Trade is not only exchanging things. Trade is also removing any kind of barriers, including, for example, labor standards. You know, rules that impose to your contracting party to adopt higher labor standards for workers, or not to, for example, not to lower your environmental standards, or not to lower your labor standards, all this kind of stuff. This is trade. This is clearly trade. Everything that facilitates trade is trade. Call it autonomic. But this is how the court envisioned this. I would say the goal of the court here is to really push for certain, let's say, for centralization, let's say, of EU trade policy. And this is what we can say for the past. Now, we will see what the court will say about the Mercosur Agreement, of course, right? Because Mercosur Agreement is heavily politically and socially charged. Now, 1 minute of your time to recap. We have talked about a lot of things. There is the recordings, I think, out there, for those of you who are not enticed enough. But what does this all tell to us about trade, integration or disintegration? Well, to recap, first, trade has always been seen as a mechanism to foster integration, okay? European integration, internally and externally. To foster the internal market, to export is a bad thing to put it, to project EU values outside the EU, to make everybody happy, make more money, okay? And this is why we have, from a legal perspective, we have the common commercial policy since a long time ago. This has been consolidated, we have firmly the Lisbon Treaty. However, it starts to show some cracks. It starts to show some problems in the 27 countries bloc. And I'm not even talking about Brexit, this will be the material for tomorrow. So, we are seeing, and the Mercosur is an example of this, CETA was another example of this, a trend towards disintegration, a trend towards pushback against EU trade policies. Where national sovereignty is in place, is at stake, ultimately democracy is at stake, this comes with different tensions. Civil society's pressure, political pressure, economic segment of society's pressure. This is all getting together, and again, I think we have seen this, especially in the last few years. And this, again, can be projected in the EU-Mercosur agreement, which apparently could be negotiated and concluded bypassing member states' national parliaments. However, with a question mark of what is going to follow in the next few weeks. So I would like you really to take away and think about how these agreements that are on paper very beneficial for everyone can ultimately, you know, end up undermining or even backfiring against the European process of integration. That's all for now. Tomorrow, Brexit stuff. Thank you for listening.